I was thinking, as I sat down to prepare my remarks, what would be a good metaphor for a plenary session in the last hour of a conference that ends on a Saturday, okay? And the images that came to my mind were kind of dreadful. So I once went to a conference in Hawaii for the annual meeting of the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychologists. And it must have been a nice conference. I mean, I won an award, apparently. They had to tell me because it sure was nice at the pool. Now, luckily, we are not in Hawaii. We're in wonderful Philadelphia. And I love the Marriott, but I'm not really feeling compelled for an iced drink on the pool deck, so that's not going to happen. But I did decide that a plenary session at the last hour of a conference is sort of like last call at a restaurant or bar after a long night out. Right? So you have likely had your fill of food and merriment when the server comes to tell you that the kitchen is closing, but you cannot resist the temptation of future denial. So you order yourself just another round. This is last call for this year. So I know you're full already, but I hope you like it or at least have room for one more. I have been teaching, as Lee has said, at the collegiate level now for the last 10 years. Now, in fact, sometime in January was my 10-year anniversary, and I know what you're thinking. He doesn't look that old. And, you know, if you're not thinking it, you should be. And so the fact of the matter is I'm actually not that old. And lucky for us, age and experience are only moderately correlated, so are age and insight. And so I know several people who have been around for a while who haven't seemed to master the art of reflection or single loop learning. And then I have students who I swear could lap all of us. And I say this by way of introduction, because I said yes to this talk for one reason and one reason only. And the reason I said yes for this talk was for my students and for what they have taught and encouraged in me and for our continued discourse, which I believe is always on their behalf. And in fact, it's kind of funny. I was sitting in my office going through the program and a student was there with me. And I realized that AAC&U wasn't just calling this a plenary session, they were calling it the culminating plenary. And so I said, oh God, that's a lot of pressure. Actually, I said something that was a little more colorful than that, but they told me that this is being recorded, so I'm going to behave myself. And so she said, she didn't really say, it was kind of like a sound. It was kind of like a pfft. And she said, that's pretty cool to me, Dr. Golom. So imagine if they called it the culminating last call. I'd be drinking and eating dessert for days. In my short and glorious career in academia so far, I've been a diversity resource assistant, an academic ceremonies and special projects coordinator, special projects, an adjunct lecturer, an assistant professor, and the associate director of executive education programs in change and consultation. So I have seen higher ed as a student, a staff member, an administrator, and contingent and tenure track faculty. I've worked at liberal arts institutions, research institutions, and the City University of New York, which Lee said, whose diversity and vitality I miss to this day. It was my favorite place to teach. Don't tell anybody I said that. Oh, it's being recorded. Oh, well. In the interest of full disclosure, too, by the way, I worked as a work study student, and so I say that for all of you who might be looking at your work studies and wondering why exactly you're paying them to watch Netflix at work. But I promise you it ends up okay. The real reason I'm here today is this. I'm an organizational psychologist, and I'm an organizational psychologist who studies diversity in the workplace, and I'm an organizational psychologist who studies diversity in the workplace who happens to be gay. I'm also a New Yorker, which, you know, is not necessarily a qualifier for anything. In fact, it could be a disqualifier, but it's important as a piece of information in case you wonder in a little while why I'm a little blunt. I'm here today to talk to you about LGBTQ issues in higher education, and I intend to do just that. But I think what's important to hold on to as I begin is that I'm going to do it the only way I know how. So informed by research as much as practice, theory as much as experience, and then, most importantly for me, deeply, deeply situated in an organizational psychology frame, right? Now, for the record, it is that last point that I think causes me the most trouble in life, and that's saying something being a gay New Yorker who's from a loud Italian family, okay? But being an organizational psychologist causes me some issues sometimes. So in a conference that celebrates diversity and difference, I feel like I have to declare myself first and foremost. There are times where my identity as a gay man aligns nicely with our current discourse on diversity issues in higher education, and it resonates with me deeply at the individual level. And then there are times where my identity as an organizational psychologist challenges that alignment and pushes it out of its comfort zone. So in the interest of full disclosure, that's a tension that I've been living with for the last few months, and I can't say I resolved that tension, and I can't say that I'm here today to do that, but I share my experience as a disclaimer moving forward. We know, I think, everybody in this room, the standard and permissible discourse on LGBTQ issues in higher education. And I would like to push and challenge that discourse where I can. I fully consent that at the end of this talk, you may not necessarily think that an organizational psychology frame captures the lived experiences of our students and their concerns as well as you might like. And that's a criticism that I can respect. But for the next half hour or so, I'd like to invite you to consider a slightly different but complementary perspective to the one that I think has been dominating our conversation. And one last disclaimer, well, two. One, I use humor, and I use it often. I mean, sometimes I'm good at it, and sometimes, as you've already seen, maybe not so much. But please do not mistake my humor as a sign of disrespect. I believe that there should be a direct correlation between the seriousness of the work and the degree to which you have to infuse it with levity. So I'm going to do that. And also, I don't like to stand still. This is a problem for me, being, a gay New Yorker. And so I asked them if I could borrow a microphone from the audience, so at any point I'm just going to pick it up and walk around, right? So I'm going to stay here as long as I can. Now, in the interest of humor, here you go. My family will tell you I'm a pain in the ass. I think Lee just told you I'm a pain in the ass, right? I've always been a pain in the ass. And so long before I became an organizational psychologist, I was a process nuisance. Okay, that's how I would describe myself. So in the first grade, I didn't like the way we were spending recess. Didn't like it. Wasn't good. Not good, right? And so I organized the class into small lunchtime groups where different members would teach, members of the first grade class, would teach and facilitate on topics in their area of specialty. It's not a joke. I'm not kidding. This is serious. Seriously, I taught math. I'm not kidding. And then there was a woman in the class, a girl in the class who taught Greek, and so she had a little group of students in the corner teaching them Greek. Right? Now, some years later, this is a totally different issue, by the way. When my parents were getting divorced, right, I was a process nuisance all over again. Now, this time it was a little different. I was sort of flabbergasted at the idea that a divorce could be happening, and nobody would want to process that with me emotionally. Like this, I just didn't understand that. Could you imagine the horror? And so my middle school heart, being the passionate heart that most middle school hearts are, really could not comprehend the sin of omission. So I learned systems theory in my doctoral program at Columbia, so I'm better now. But as Lee can tell you, I'm not blind. And so part of the training of organizational psychologists is to learn how to diagnose the conversations in groups and in organizations that are not happening or that are happening below the surface. And that was clearly a good fit for a lifelong obsession of mine. I am infinitely curious about the conversations we are, and most importantly, are not having. And I often want to know what that means. This, by the way, is much to the chagrin of my faculty colleagues because, I can derail a faculty meeting like nobody's business. I mean, I just ask one of these, bomb questions, and people are like, oh, here we go, 20 minutes, right? My contention in this talk is that when it comes to LGBTQ issues and other diversity issues in higher education, we are not always having the right conversations, or at least we're not always having full ones. And that is not to the detriment of the work that we're doing, right? We are doing good work. But it is to the detriment of our institutions and the students we cycle through them, particularly their ability to think about diversity and social justice issues in complex and organizationally sophisticated ways. So let me explain. As a campus diversity advocate, I have to tell you, I have been fed emotionally and intellectually, as I am sure many of you have been, by the diversity protests and social justice movements that have seemed to grip higher education through the end of 2015. I think in many instances, in most instances, these were movements of real substance led by individuals who have been marginalized more than they have mattered. And these were movements and are movements for the kind of individuals and interventions that this conference is centered around. And like any good movement should do, I have been moved, right? I have been in Baltimore at the height of the Freddie Gray tragedy and watching the community in Baltimore come together, and it has been more moving than the news headlines would portray it, just around how much work we are doing on the ground. Yet, as the headlines began to unfold and reactions to that work began to accumulate, I found myself fixated on the idea that our burgeoning national conversation was less fruitful than I had hoped, right? And so first, I thought it was incomplete. And not simply incomplete, and I don't know if any of you have felt this way, maybe you have, but occasionally cringe-inducing, right? And both for the reactions that we have gotten from certain segments of the population, but also for an intensely myopic focus on the experience of individual students, and occasionally an almost parody-worthy Saturday Night Live-esque series of headlines that, though they may have had some merit, occasionally made me feel like I was entering into some social justice twilight zone, right? So you are probably already familiar with these headlines, but I did a little scanning, so let's take a look. Now, I pulled some of my favorite news stories from the last few months, and I tried to rely on reputable in quotes, news outlets and even campus news sources, rather than this kind of new industry of higher ed smear websites that I didn't even know existed, which is a separate topic for another talk. So you're familiar with some of these. I won't go through all of them, but there was a news story reported by the Associated Press, right, of students who were attempting to rename a building on campus because the name of the building had racial overtones. Now, I will say that this is a noble pursuit. No college student should graduate from an institution of higher education in America without learning the history of race in this country. That should not occur, right? Now, the problem with this headline, and some of you may be aware of this already, is that the building was named after the university's former president. And so it became a much more complex and nuanced situation than many of the headlines portrayed. There was the news story reported by the New York Times about students who demanded that a caterer be fired because of a litany of offenses, ranging from cultural appropriation to cultural insensitivity, including poorly prepared Japanese sushi. Now, that may be another noble pursuit, but as my dear Loyola colleague Michiko Iwasaki, who is from Japan, so succinctly put it to me, Frank, most American sushi is poorly prepared sushi. Hello. There was an article in the Washington Post about a yoga class and cultural appropriation, which I won't get into at this time. And then, not to be outdone, LGBTQ students are part of this wave of headlines too. So the Daily Beast reported on a story about students who were demanding that a screening of the film Stonewall, which, for the record, is not without its legitimate criticism, be canceled due to it being discursively violent and reinforcing a hierarchy of oppression. And the Daily Beast quoted a first-year student as saying, "I think the college should cancel the screening because the safety and well-being of students surpasses the importance of a critical discussion." Now, personally, I think the college should have canceled the screening because it wasn't a good movie, but what do I know, right? And in fact, what do we all know? So I've been thinking as I ran through this litany of headlines whether we can really trust the reporting or whether I'd be getting myself into hot water and be hashtagged to death. And then I realized it doesn't matter. What can we know about the specifics of any events on campus based on a 100-word news article? Not so much, not particularly much at all. What can we know about the popular zeitgeist when it comes to how diversity in higher education is being discussed? Arguably a lot more, right? We have, as you know, that's why you're here, that's why I'm here. I have loved being here. We have serious work to do, and we have serious work to do around the very constituencies that are highlighted in all of these headlines. And these headlines, whether they're 100% accurate or not, are not always the most serious headlines that should be running through our news publications, right? And if anything, I think that they have taken serious concepts like representation and microaggressions and in some ways turned them into unhelpful caricatures of themselves. Secondly, and more importantly, I think I decided that our burgeoning national discourse wasn't just becoming parody, it also struck me as vaguely ahistorical and acontextual. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the website thedemands.org, right? And so lists the demands of many of the student groups who have been protesting structural racism and inequality on campus, and LGBTQ students have gotten into that. I was reading an article the other day about students at Lawrence University who are also put forth demands related to LGBTQ issues. But you notice quite a bit when you read through these demands, right? Now, the first thing you notice, I hope you notice, at least I think we notice, are the painful experiences of minority students and faculty, exclusion, lack of access, and disturbing racism and microaggressions. And, you know, we had a similar situation at my university where there was a large piece of butcher block paper, and people were putting all kinds of microaggressions that were said to them that they had overheard on campus, and it hung by the Starbucks. You had to walk by it every morning when you went to get coffee. I mean, everybody saw it, and it started a campus conversation, and I think that's good. But you also notice in the discourse, at least I have, a sense that this movement is new, or that at least in this moment in time, something new and something important is happening that we haven't seen before and that will continue to happen. And this, by the way, seems to be coming from movement supporters and detractors alike. So on my own campus, you have students pushing with incredible fervor for diversity training. And they're joined by an array of faculty administrators who I swear sometimes act like they've never been down this road before. And then there's others who seem genuinely surprised by the fact that perhaps we haven't made as much progress on diversity as we've led ourselves to believe. Now, for those of us who do this work, how many are really surprised, right? Not that many. And in fact, if you'll permit me, I swear this is not dirty, but I'd like to do a little headline voyeurism again. So here you go, the New York Times. This is my go-to for headline voyeurism. Evergreen State seeks minority voices in classrooms. University of Michigan finds the taint of racial trouble. Swarthmore students forego part of vacation to study diversity. And from AIDS to volleyball, it's time for freshman orientation. So here's a quote from an administrator in the last article. Recently, colleges have focused on a new element that is fast becoming a cornerstone of orientation programs. And then I'll move you to the last paragraph. The world has changed so much with terrorism, racism, all this sexual harassment stuff, said Deborah Lamp, Assistant Director of Student Life at Fairleigh Dickinson. We need to let them know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable on our campus. The only problem? She said this in 1995. In fact, all of those headlines were from the 1990s. And if you're bored, and I clearly was, you could take whatever publication that whets your appetite and find a bevy of headlines from the 90s that read exactly like that. Trainings, orientation, recruitment, retention, exclusion, microaggressions, you name it, we've seen it. What's old is apparently new again, like pleated pants. Okay, maybe not pleated pants. I can't wear pleated. It's a terrible sight if I put on a pair of, not good. I mean, you can't see me right now, but it's not good. Now, don't just take my word for it. The Chronicle recently published an op-ed by William Harvey, distinguished scholar at the American Association for Access, Equity, and Diversity. Have any of you read this article? Okay, do not give away what I'm going to do. Here's a quote from the article. While greater number of minority group students are matriculating in colleges and universities than ever before, to a large degree, those students find themselves outside the mainstream of campus life. At best, the feeling that many have is that their presence is simply tolerated as a politically expedient maneuver. At worst, they feel that they are victims of subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racist attitudes and practices on the part of classmates and instructors alike. Unfortunately, that's not the punchline. The punchline, as it were, is that he's been providing this paragraph to colleagues repeatedly over the last few months, basking in their words of affirmation and agreement, and then politely letting them know that he's quoting from an article that he wrote in 1981. Oops. Change is many things to many people, but repeating the same patterns over and over again, it is not. So what does any of this have to do with LGBTQ issues in higher education? Well, everything. If you ask me, if the task before us is to talk about how we can move the needle forward to ensure institutional change and academic success, of sexual minority individuals, then it would seem to me that the first question we might want to ask is, how have we been moving the needle? And my contention is that we haven't always been moving the needle very well. And that's not to knock the work that we're doing. The needle is moving. It's just not moving as quickly or as smartly as it could. So how is it possible that for all the markers of progress on LGBT issues, there still remains work to do? And how is it possible that student demands, even if they are met, will be met with students in 10 years making similar demands? Right? And so the answer, I would argue, rests again in our ongoing conversation. Right? We're not always having full conversations. And our current discourse on diversity and change may only be able to be so ahistorical and acontextual because perhaps it hasn't produced as much change as we had hoped. So here's an example. One of the more pressing issues facing LGBT students and faculty in higher education is the inclusion and protection of transgender individuals in transgender studies. Right? Now, I would be the first to argue that we have a lot of work to do on LGBT issues in general, but the need for attention to trans people and trans causes is abundantly clear, and it's been clear for quite some time. And so it will not surprise you, thank you, that I was delighted to see faculty and staff at Loyola, particularly in the faculty and staff affinity group, take up the cause of transgender issues on campus. I thought, finally, way to go, 2015, right? And in fact, we spent months and hours discussing, researching, re-reviewing, and then rediscussing, re-reviewing, and re-researching proposals for bathroom signage. And this, by the way, came with an incredible amount, in good higher education fashion, of consultation with HR, with legal, with student life, with other offices on campus, which is consulting our life away, really, and almost to the point where it became an office parody. In particular, did you know that people with PhDs have a lot to say about what constitute a right and wrong sign? It was kind of stunning. Now, there aren't as many ways to convey a welcoming campus message as gender-neutral bathrooms. And so I understand and I fully support this change as an important one in the lives of transgender students and faculty, particularly those in transition. But what I didn't get, and I still don't get, was the sheer sense of satisfaction that overtook some of my colleagues when a few signs went up on campus and a few bathrooms were changed. As if this meant that we had produced some kind of significant cultural transformation for trans issues on campus. For the record, we didn't, okay? And the reason I know this is because the one out transgender student that semester at Loyola happened to be a student in my research methods class. And he went home every day to significant amounts of harassment in his dorm room that he suffered in the small quiet of my office. And he refused to bring it through an organizational system that he felt was a bit uninformed on these issues to this day. 10 years ago, as you're about to find out, I sat in my professor's office having a very similar experience as a gay man. What's old is new again. So yes, we can and we should talk about bathrooms. We could talk about the curriculum in our classrooms, and we can talk about the microaggressions in our dorm rooms too. These are important conversations in their own right, but they leave a lot of the rooms empty. And quite frankly, we aren't building capacity in higher education for LGBTQ students and studies unless we are talking about the whole damn house, right? So, I recently published a chapter, Lee talked about it, on creating change around LGBTQ issues, which is in a new book on creating inclusive environments for LGBTQ students and studies. The recommendations in that chapter are what I'm going to close with today. But before I get there, I feel compelled, or dare I say obligated, to expand a bit on the idea that we're not having the right conversations. And so if I've learned anything after being a process nuisance for all these years, it's that if you're going to criticize or be curious about the conversation that's happening, you better have an alternative at the ready and really, really fast. So let's talk about some conversations. The first conversation I want to talk about is the context conversation. So the first problem, as I see it, is that sometimes we forget that organizational behavior is jointly determined by the individual and also the environment that they find themselves in, okay? In higher education, I think we spend a lot of time on the individual, right? Worried quite rightly about the experience of individual students and faculty and developing strategies to improve their individual experience. Sounds good. Is good. Here's the problem. We're not always paying attention to whether the larger context will support those strategies or those students. Okay? And what counts as context to me is wide-ranging, right? It's the history of the organization, its culture, its demographic makeup, the type of institution it is, right? So in the LGBTQ realm, how many of your campuses, I'm sure many do, have specific policies and procedures for bias reporting? Right? A number of campuses have this, right? So I recently sat in a meeting where the students were criticizing the bias reporting system as kind of an abyss or graveyard where complaints go to die, right? They submit a complaint and then they never hear anything about it ever again. So the administrator, who was charged with the bias reporting system, got up and gave this impassioned plea. Look what I just did. You see where the L went? The impassioned plea, right, thank you, Tia, about her care and her due diligence of the bias reporting system, okay? Up she went. And then the students came in, and everybody's in this conversation about, is it working, is it not working? And I'm thinking the whole time to myself, hello, do we have a systemic understanding? Do we have a bigger understanding about why there's an increase in bias incidents in the first place? You know, microaggressions are not free-floating plants that just pop up and hit you out of nowhere, right? They occur in a context, in a soil, if you will. And so to me, chasing each one down is the equivalent to weeding, right? If you pull them up one by one, you will never be done, right? That work will never end. But ensuring that the organizational context is fertile ground is a far better, is not fertile ground, rather, for microaggressions, is a far better and more important strategy. So to mix my agrarian metaphors, it's not always about how many bad apples or how many not enough good ones, right? It's often about bad barrels or the context that allows certain behaviors to occur. So let's have the context conversation for a little while and not talk just about individuals. The second problem, or second conversation that I'd like to have, if this will allow me to do that, but I don't teach with PowerPoint because it's anathema to good learning. I just can't bring myself to do it. So I'm old school with like chalk and an eraser. My students can't handle it. But I wanted to do a little PowerPoint for you today, and so just bear with me if the slides don't quite match up to my very slow presentation style. So the second conversation I don't think we're having is the levels conversation, right? We tend to focus our interventions in higher education at the individual level. So recruitment, retaining, replacing, training, coaching, right? In the organizational literature, that's your buffet of individual level interventions for change. I mean, what kind of last call is that? I don't want that last call, right? That's not like the menu that I'm going for my last one at the restaurant. Here's the problem. There's very little evidence that changing individuals or groups actually changes the organization. And in fact, sometimes quite the opposite. So I think the literature on the effectiveness of diversity training, particularly in the workplace, is a great case in point, right? Sometimes training works, but for training to work, you have to do a lot of things. And it's a lot of things that cost a lot of money that we are not often doing, right? So one of the go-to demands of student groups is training, right? I demanded that LGBT issues be included in RA training when I was an undergraduate student. Yet, according to the research, that is more likely than not a waste of time and money. So here's a quote from a landmark diversity training study. Practices that target bias through diversity evaluations and diversity training show virtually no effect in the aggregate. They show modest positive effects when responsibility structures are in place, but they sometimes show negative effects. Research to date from HR experts and psychologists suggests that the interactive training workshops of the kind we examine often generate backlash. And as I might say, of course they do. And that's because organizational behavior is a multi-level phenomenon, right? We are very focused on targeting the individual level, but we are ignoring the group, organizational, industry, and national forces that influence people long after the training has ended. And so even if they get something from the training for a week, those other contextual factors are going to pull them back to where they were, more likely than not. Which brings me to my final point. The real problem is that I think we are not having the systems conversation. The dirty secret is this. Fundamentally altered organizational behavior requires an altered system. That's it, right? Anything short of that is window dressing. And while that may really work well for the people who are in the room with the new curtains, an extreme home makeover, this is not. Right? So many of us have adopted the language of systemic issues and systems change, but I don't think everybody knows what that means or even how you operationalize it, right? And that's because systems are hard. They are hard to see, they are hard to change, and they are hard to maneuver. And without getting into the technical specifics, that's because they maneuver back, right? They come right back at you. And so to change an organization is to change its culture. It's to shift its norms, values, beliefs, and attitudes literally out from underneath it, but without it knowing what those norms are, and usually without it realizing what you're doing. Good luck. Let me know how it goes, okay? People's unquestioned and often unconscious norms and values are to organizations what the third rail is to a subway car. So it powers it silently and under most circumstances with very little fanfare, but try and touch it directly and it will electrocute you just the same. Right? Now, I have to owe it to my grandmother. She passed away 2 years ago, and I was thinking about all her many values and norms that she had. And had I tried to touch them or question them, I would have been electrocuted too. So just know that if you don't see it organizationally, you certainly see it at the individual level. So, we don't touch the third rail, right? We don't go near it. We hang signage. We instruct faculty to use inclusive language. We have affinity groups. We hold a movie night. Maybe we show Stonewall. Maybe not, right? And maybe we're ambitious and we do a combination of these things. But in my experience, and again, this is just my experience, it's the rare organization that combines these tactics into a coherent and systemically driven strategy that is aimed squarely, deliberately, and methodically at changing the organization's heteronormative culture. That's hard to do, right? And if organizational psychology has taught me anything, right, in my short but glorious career, it's that most change efforts fail because they do not make organizational culture the target of the change. And I can't be certain, but maybe that's why William Harvey can pass off an essay he wrote 35 years ago as something he wrote today. So speaking of things written years ago, I gotta move. I'm sorry. I can't. Oh, this slide is also going to move. Everything's moving right now. You can stretch if you want. This is like a movement break. Speaking of things written years ago, it is 2:35 in the morning, and I am listening to the sounds of my ex-roommate and his friends kicking in the door to our suite in Guilford. I must admit, though, that I am hardly surprised. This sort of thing has happened before. At various points throughout the semester, I have been the victim of both anti-gay harassment and verbal assaults. I have repeatedly been called a fag and have borne the nickname Francine. I have been called a homo and have been told on numerous occasions that I am going to insert whatever derogatory comment you wish. I have even been barricaded in my room. Well, actually, let me go back to the actual text. I have entered my dorm room to find comments written on the dry erase board, or to find that my roommates have left Hustler magazines strewn across my bed. I have even been barricaded in my room in some supposed practical joke. I can assure everyone, however, that what has happened is not a joke, nor is it an isolated episode. Harassment on the basis of sexual orientation has occurred and continues to occur throughout this campus, and incidents, even more severe than my own, have taken place. So I wrote those words in 2002 in a letter to the editor in my student newspaper after enduring months of anti-gay harassment at the hands of my roommates, including death threats and having my belongings urinated on. So I do not speak about this much in public, and in fact, I've only done so one other time. 6 years ago, I was invited back to my undergraduate institution to talk about my experiences as a gay man on campus. As you can imagine, I had a lot to say after all that, and luckily, it's much better than it sounds. You know, I came to this work not simply because I have a proclivity for thinking like an organizational psychologist, I came to this work because something terrible happened to me. And I decided that if it was going to be at all tolerable, it was going to change the trajectory of my professional life, and so it did. And I suspect that's a lot of why many of us are in this room. I became a gay organizational psychologist because I wanted to understand the anti-gay harassment I experienced on campus. And I wanted to know it not just as my individual plight, but as a manifestation of the larger systemic issues of campus homophobia and heterosexism I learned it to be. And I have followed that intellectual journey as I've studied and written about changing campuses for the last 10 years. And for the moment, it's that intellectual journey, the integration of my teaching, my personal experience leading change, and my identity that has led me here. So if we want to build individual and organizational capacity for creating change around LGBT issues in higher education, then I believe, based on the research and my own work transforming organizations, that we have to do 7 things, okay? Now, you know, by the way, when a speaker starts to count down the 7 things that we're nearing the end. So this is the last 7, I promise, and then I'm done, okay? First, we need to manipulate the context by creating a strong sense of urgency. There are times that we do this really well as diversity advocates, and then there's times that we don't, right? So in particular, we know how to create urgency around incidents of hate and egregious microaggressions. We know how to do that, right? But sometimes we struggle to do this without the context of some kind of violent or assaultive event, right? And admittedly, I think we need to be better at this. Change will not occur if the context has not been primed to support it. And I think if the current social justice movements in higher education have done anything well, it's this, right? Our students have created a sense of urgency that we were not capable of, but they were. Now, second, we need to harness all this energy, right? We need to harness and channel this momentum by creating a vision and strategy for the change effort that sticks. So, you know, loose, particularly wasted energy is dreadful in an organizational context when it comes to making effective change, right? So a clear vision steers everybody in a particular direction, right? It can serve as a nice superordinate goal to help people when change gets messy. And all change is a mess in the middle, right? And so we need a vision to kind of hold people in line when they're a little bit out of the boat, let's say. Now, this is a must. A vision is a must. A strategy is a must, right? But it has to be done smartly, right? Again, context matters. So what's a compelling vision for a religiously affiliated institution may not be a compelling vision for your school, right? So the first task is to figure out, find a vision or a change narrative that would be contagious or sticky for your campus, right? It turns out, actually, that LGBT tolerance fits very well with the Jesuit educational mission. I learned that. It really worked, right? Third, you have to involve the right people to communicate and reinforce the vision. In other words, you cannot just have a strategy, you have to be strategic. Now, I know this is going to not be what some people want to hear, but not everyone is an effective spokesperson. Not everyone is a well-connected individual within the organization, and not everyone has LGBTQ expertise, even if that's how they identify, right? So the informal leadership network on campus is as important as the formal leadership network, if not more so. Successful change is about building coalitions. So you have to pay attention to where are the most critical nodes in this network and figure out how to activate them so that the change can succeed. Fourth, you have to align day-to-day organizational life with the new vision, and then you have to stop behavior that interferes with that alignment. So admittedly, this is another one that I think higher education does well, right? Adjust the campus policies and procedures, change the responsibility for different administrators' jobs, have LGBT awareness campaigns, et cetera, right? Do all that. I was sitting at a couple of tables yesterday where people were giving strategies from their campus, and everybody was just writing it down, right? Writing, you know, actually not even strategies, tactics or different programming down. That's great, but do all of it according to some larger systemically focused vision, right? If you can repeatedly reinforce this vision at all levels of the organization, you actually increase your chances of the organizational culture aligning with that vision as the new behaviors get reinforced over time, right? But that takes a long time, right? They say that most culture change initiatives are at least 3 to 5 year initiatives, at least. And I would argue that for diversity initiatives, it's longer than that, right? It's not a new technology system that we're rolling out. Fifth, independently sustain and institutionalize the vision. So, change initiatives, I don't know how many of you feel this way, have a tendency to be a little bit reactive and events-based, right? So there's an incident of LGBT hate on campus, call a town hall, right? Students of color are reporting feeling unsafe on campus, double the recruitment efforts, right? The problem with this is that the change effort actually gets attached to a specific narrative or event. And so, it dies with that narrative or event the minute it passes from memory, right? That's not a sustainable solution. So your tactics and your strategies have to be embedded into parts of the campus that are going to outlast people, right? Structures, policies, and most importantly, curricula, right? It needs to be there. That will outlast a student for all their egregious experience that it might have been, like mine was. The curricular will be there. Well, had I not gone back to Loyola, wouldn't be, right? But you get my point. By the way, this point means that it's our work to do this and not our students, right? And whether we like it or not, they pass from memory. And so if I could just pick on the faculty in the room for a second, faculty, some administrators, but faculty, like dinosaurs, don't pass from memory as easily, right? But the students do, right? I will be at Loyola for a very long time, so it's my work, not theirs. Sixth, here I come, throw a party, have fun, get wasted. Just kidding, okay? So, just joking, but we're nearing the end and I can't take it anymore. So, seriously, do orchestrate, reward, and celebrate small successes, right? In other words, give people a slice of pie. I don't want to channel too much of our current political discourse, okay? Because, you got to be careful when you do things like that. But who wants to be part of a low-energy campaign? And who wants to be a loser, right? So it's hard to sustain momentum for 3 to 5 years for a culture change if you're constantly just working and waiting to reach the pot of gold you may never reach, right? At least while you're there. So plan and execute periodic strategic victories that are small in scope but have significant impact, right? In the organizational literature, we call this small wins, right? Actually go out and orchestrate small wins. So I was once part of an LGBT group, you'll appreciate this, that took over a campus in honor of its, wait for it, 8th year anniversary. 8. There's really nothing particularly significant about the number 8, at least to me, right? But you would have thought we were celebrating a centennial, right? I mean, the campus was glowing and rainbow and signage and people and just a buzz with activities and events, and everyone's like, oh my God, what's going on? And it's we're celebrating our 8th year anniversary. And people, front page headlines in the student newspaper, people went crazy, right? It doesn't matter what it is, find something and celebrate it. This is too long to not have kind of a small win, right? And lastly, evaluate, titrate, and recalibrate the change effort. This is a nice way of saying gather data. Assess, right? Now, look, I know that nobody wants one more thing to measure, but the fact is, as Lee has told us, assessment is ultimately about change and transformation, right? So too many organizations waste resources on initiatives that have actually no known return on investment. And too few organizations target future interventions based on holes in the data. Now, I'm not that kind of doctor, but my first rule is still do no harm, right? And you can't do that without information on what's working and what's not working, right? So for example, it's 2016, and I am still aghast at the number of campus climate surveys that do not ask me about my experiences as an LGBT person on campus or about the LGBT climate. 2016. We just took one. It wasn't in there, right? You don't fight cancer unless you know you have it, regardless of how long it's been there, right? So, and just because I have to say this, and don't take this the wrong way, but it's been suggested to me by people before. So, no, same-sex marriage doesn't mean that we can stop asking about heterosexist bias. Please, really, come on, right? Now, will doing all of these things shift the thinking, practices, and cultures of our campuses to promote LGBTQ inclusion and achievement for good? No. But Will they move the needle more sturdily and with a little bit less recoil? I think so. If you asked me, what will enable us to engage and build more inclusive environments for LGBTQ students and studies? My answer is this. We need to talk about more than LGBTQ students and studies. We need to talk about context, we need to talk about levels, we need to talk about systems, and we need to aim our interventions accordingly. And most importantly, we need to developmentally encourage our students to do the same. That is how we transcend marginalization and intolerance, and how we make all of our students, LGBT and otherwise, far more nuanced, complex, and savvy in their thinking around issues of diversity and difference than many of them actually are. Right? They're developmentally in one place, and I think it's our job to bring them to another. I do not, as much as I love all of you, want to be giving this speech again 35 years from now. I would like to be giving a different speech, right? And I suspect that many of you feel the same way. So, here's the charge at the end. Pick the diversity conversation you and your students are most tired of having, and see if you can make this year its last call. Thank you, everybody.